Hey everyone, and welcome to my channel. Today I want to share with you my reading stats video for 2025. This is part of my end of the year content. In the next couple of weeks I will upload a ton of videos wrapping up 2025, and I already did quite a few videos looking ahead to 2026. So if you want to check all of these videos out, feel free to go to my channel and also to subscribe so you won't miss the rest of them. I would love to have you here. But now let's talk about my reading stats. Now, as always, my reading goal for 2025 was 52 books, and in the end I managed to read 131 books. Now, this is the most amount I have ever read in a year, and to be fair, this was only possible because of my 6-month sabbatical that I took. I did a lot of reading during that time, and I also read quite a few shorter books this year, which sometimes, I'm reading the big fantasy tomes. And so yeah, this year was definitely exceptional in that sense. Now, the big goal for my reading in 2025 was my TBR reduction. I started out with 37 books on my TBR that were my pre-2025 TBR, and by the end of the year I had finished all but 3 of these books, so we did really well in that regard. I didn't exactly reach a 0 TBR because I had acquired some new books that you can see behind me as well. So we're starting out 2026 with 23 books on the TBR still. But they are new books, so it's a lot more exciting. Now, with these 131 books, I managed to read 32,378 pages in the year. So that is quite a lot. That means I have read around 2,700-ish pages every month and about 88 pages every day. Now, my goal is to read on average about 50 pages a day, so that worked out really well. The month where I read the most pages was in October. There are multiple reasons for that. One reason is that I read a couple of comic books in that month, and there was also a readathon going on hosted by my friend Cleo from the channel Bemused Bookworm that pushed me to do a 24-hour in 48-hour little readathon, which I will never do again, but it added a lot of pages. My least amount of pages I read in the month of January. So in October I read over 4,000 pages. In January I read 1,350 pages. So that's kind of the range throughout the month. And looking at audiobooks, I read 43 audiobooks in 2025, and I listened to 29,834 minutes of audiobook in the year of 2025. That means I listened to around 497 hours of audiobook. That means I listened to about 41 hours of audiobook every month, about 10 hours a week. And I also listened to about 81 minutes a day. I don't have a set audiobook goal, but I usually, as I said, listen to around 10 hours per week. The most amount of listening to my audiobook I did in November, and the least amount I did in April for some reason. I was very intrigued to see how my audiobook reading would change during the sabbatical, because I used to listen to my audiobook while walking to work, and obviously that then didn't happen anymore. And that accounted for about half an hour every day. However, I still listen to my audiobook about the same amount, just doing different things. I use them for chores around the house, and I still leave the house sometimes. So there is still sometimes walking and going grocery shopping and stuff like that. So my reading really didn't change that much during the sabbatical at all with audiobooks. So in November, I listened to roughly 3,000 minutes of audiobooks for my best month, and in April I listened to not quite 2,000 minutes of audiobooks for my least read month. So you can see that there isn't a lot of a gap between the two. I also reread quite a few books. I usually set myself a loose goal of rereading 12 books in a year. In 2025, I managed to reread 11 books, so I did really well in that regard, and I had 0 DNFs. Now let's go quickly into a couple of monthly stats. Now, for my books read, in total I read, as I said, 131 books. This was not evenly distributed over over the month at all. I definitely had highs and lows. My lowest month was January with only 4 books finished because I was reading some big fantasy books for the beginning of the year. And my highest number was actually in December, where I read 18 books, but some of these were very short, like novellas for the Christmas time, and also some short stories. You can definitely see the sabbatical effect in the month as well. However, it was like kind of like slowly growing, which I thought was an interesting thing as well. Now, for the books I have bought, overall, I bought or received 69 books in the year. I think 44 of those I bought myself and the rest were gifts. I will have numbers for that later on as well. Now we're looking at the month, and we can see that again, it was not evenly distributed. There wasn't a month where I didn't acquire a book. However, I got the most books in April because that was when I discovered Libro.fm sales. And I got the least amount of books in March when I was really trying to read down that TBR. Last but not least, for the monthly stats, we have the books I have borrowed. And in total, I have borrowed 43 books. I did not read all of those. We will again look at that in a second. However, again, we do have a month where I borrowed a lot of books and months that were a little bit better. The month where I borrowed the most amount of books was in May. That was definitely the sabbatical effect, my moment of freedom where I just wanted to celebrate my reading. And I borrowed the least amount of books in January, March, and April when I was still working. I also tracked the net change in my TBR numbers, and again you can see a clear sabbatical effect. So at the beginning of the year is usually my birthday, so I do acquire a few books at the beginning of the year. Then in March I reduced it, and then the Libro.fm sale happened, and then the kind of borrowing books because of sabbatical freedom happened. So the real TBR reduction didn't start until August, but from that point onwards, I did quite a good job, I would say. And overall, I managed to reduce the TBR by 14 books. But as I said, almost all of the ones that are still on my TBR now are new books. Next up, let's go through some stats of the books that I have read, and we can start out with the page length. I have 2 graphs for that. We have one with the books that I read with my eyeballs, like excluding audiobooks. And you can see that I definitely tend to read like mid-length books the most, but I do read some larger ones and some shorter ones. However, this year I didn't really have like the super long books. I didn't read anything that was like over 900 or 1,000 pages. And then we also have the graph with all of the books. So this is also with the audiobooks added in for the page length. And again, you see it doesn't really change a lot, but I did read quite a few very short books on audio and also very big books on audio as well. So the like end categories do gain a little. For the format of my books, it looks very similar to the way it always looks. So my most read format is paperbacks. I do prefer reading paperbacks. Then we have audiobooks, and then ebooks, and the hardcovers are kind of the loser of the bunch. I don't really like reading hardback books. I find it quite uncomfortable, but sometimes with the new releases or when I get them as a gift, they are in hardcover, and that's fine too. The ebooks definitely gained a lot because of my Libby access through my local library. That is something that I didn't have for a long time, and that is where most of my ebooks come from. Not all of them, but most of them. For the publication year, you can see that I tend to read very recent books. Most of the books I read were published in the 2020s, some of them even this year, and only a few of them are older or like before the 2010s. Now, a number that is always very interesting to me is the TBR reads versus books I bought new. And you can see that usually I read a lot of new books because I usually don't have a huge backlog of audiobooks, and then also the library books count into that category as well. So about 70% of my reading was new books, and only about 30% were books that were already on my TBR at the start of the year. Now, for the star rating, again, this looks similar to my previous years. This is the first time in a long time I had a 1.5 star read, my worst read of the year, a book that I had gotten gifted many years ago and then never picked up because I knew I wouldn't like it. And yeah, I should have just given up on it and just give it away. But yeah, my average rating is 3.9 stars, so it is very close to 4, which is usually where I end up with my reading of the year. For age group, most of my books are adult books. That is just, I'm an adult. I mostly read books for adults, but I do enjoy a good YA book or sometimes a middle grade as well. About 2/3 of my reading are standalone books, which might be surprising because I am such a big fantasy lover, but my other two favorite genres, horror and literary fiction, usually produce standalones, so that is why I always have a little bit more standalones than series reading. If we look at trilogies and series overall, they're almost even in the numbers. I read very few duologies this year, and that's something I want to change because I do love a good duology. For the language read in, I technically could read books in 3 languages. Now, 2 of them I can actually read, and then one I want to try read some children's books. So all of the books I've read this year were in English or in German, and English books with 85% were the majority. I would really like to try reading a children's book in Italian, but this year I have not done that. For books read in translation, I read 15 books in translation. That was about 11% of my reading. The languages that these books were translated from were Japanese, French, English, Swedish, Russian, and Italian. Now, the English books were translated into German, obviously. Last but not least, for the genres that I have read, my favorite genre is fantasy. With almost 40%, this is my most read genre, and I'm not surprised by that. The second place goes to literary fiction with about 10% of my reading, and then we have horror with about 9.5% of my reading. Now, this is also not surprising to me because these are my favorite genres. For diversity, I do track different things such as race or LGBT categories and feminism, all of that kind of stuff, religions that are not Christian, and 70 of my 131 books had some kind of diversity in them. Next up, let's quickly talk about the authors I have read this year. Storygraph has a little list of authors that you read multiple times. So I will tell you the authors that I have read 3 books from. That is Robin Hobb, Heather Fawcett, Emma Carrick, Marjorie Liu, Agweke Emezi, Brandon Sanderson, Rincho Pecco, AJ Heckworth, and Rebecca Roanhorse. Those are the authors that I read 3 books from, and that is the most amount that I have for this year. As always, about 2/3 of the books I read were written by women, and about 25% by men, and then there's also quite a few books that were written by non-binary authors. For race, I only track whether the author is white or a person of color, because I don't want this to be complicated and I don't know. I just don't feel comfortable with a lot of stuff you can figure out about the authors. So in this one, I'm not very happy with it, but it is the result of the TBR project because a lot of the books on my TBR that were left over were from white authors. So about 31% of the books I read this year were from authors of color, which I want this number to be much higher. Then I also track whether the author is new to me, and about 46% of the authors I've read this year were new to me. For continent, you can see that most of the authors I read from are from North America as well as Europe. I did read some books from African and Asian authors, but I really didn't do a great job with the other continents this year, so that's something to improve upon. Similar to the continents are the countries. Most books I read were from authors from the US, followed by the UK and Germany, but I did have a few like cool countries in there as well, like Tanzania, the Philippines, Indonesia, Zimbabwe, Malaysia, India, Belarus, South Africa. So even though I didn't read like a ton from these countries, I think that I had some that were quite interesting. And again, I tried tracking some diversity aspects from the authors, and for 56 of the authors I've read from, I tracked some kind of a diversity thing. So now we have books that I have bought. Let's look at some of those numbers. First of all, for age group, similar to my read books, I mostly bought adult books. That is not very surprising. About 83% of my bought books were adult books. Now I have another monthly stat, and that is the money I've spent on books. Now this might not always correspond completely with the amount of books I have received and bought, because gifts, I don't pay any money for them. So it's not necessarily the month where I have received the highest amount of books that has always been the most expensive one for me. And so you can see that I spent most money on books in April, probably because of that Libra.fm sale, even though I made some really good deals in that sale. And I spent the lowest amount of money in March, where I did not pay for a single book. Overall, I spent 360 euros and 41 cents on books. That means that I spend about 30 euro per month, as well as 8 euro per book. Now that 8 euro number does not include the gifts, so that is really like the average of the books that I have actually bought. Now for genre as well, we're not surprised to see that the most bought genre for me was fantasy, this time followed by horror as well as non-fiction and thriller. Because literary fiction is usually more easily available at the library, so I don't get those that often. Now, an important question for me is always whether I have actually read the books that I have bought. And for 2025, I have read about 70% of the books that I have bought, and I have not read about 30%. So you can see them behind me. You know where they are. And last but not least, where did I get my books from? And this year I changed my audiobook subscription from Audible to Libro.fm. So most books actually I bought through Libro.fm, with about 40% of my books from Libro.fm. And the least amount of books that I bought were from a German chain called Thalia. I also got 24 books as a gift this year. And a fun stat for me is that I bought 6 books during my travels. Okay, we almost made it. Let's talk about the books I have borrowed. For age range, again, adult books are the majority of what I borrow. 90% of the books I have borrowed were adult books. Throughout the month, you can see how much money I saved by borrowing books. Now, for this, I only count the books that I actually end up reading. If I return them unread, I don't put in money amount that I have saved. So you can see that I saved the most amount of money in May, where I saved 66 euro from the books I have borrowed, and the least amount was in January, where I didn't borrow any books. Overall, I have saved 484 euros and 11 cents because I borrowed books instead of buying them, and like almost 500 euros saved is a good number for me. For the genres I have borrowed, again, fantasy is the winner. I borrowed about 28% of fantasy books, followed by literary fiction. As I said, these are usually quite easily available, horror as well as thriller. Now the question, do I actually read the books I borrow from the library? And usually I do. I read 86% of the books I have borrowed from the library this year. And where do I get these books from, you might ask? Now, most of these books I do get through Libby. About 54% of my borrowed books were through Libby, followed by Audible, which I still used at the beginning of the year, and there you can listen to some books for free, even though last time I checked that had completely changed and I didn't really see any books anymore that I was interested in that I could listen to for free, so I don't know what's going on there. And then my physical library, I also borrowed a few books from, but not as regularly as I use Libby. And with that, I hope I have thought of everything. I think I didn't mention my shortest and my longest book that I've read. My shortest book was The Sixth Death of the Saint, which I gave 5 stars, and my longest book was Fool's Fate, which I also gave 5 stars. So I thought that was kind of a fun thing that like the two extremes of my reading were both 5-star books. But yeah, I think with that we have really finished talking about numbers here. I hope this video was somewhat enjoyable. I hope you learned a little bit about my reading. If you have any fun stats you want to let me know about your reading in the comments, I would love to hear about that. Also, don't forget to leave a like, that always helps me out, and subscribe if you want to see more of my end of the year content and my content in general. I will talk to you very soon. Bye!